All right, Dr. Garry Fettke, welcome to the Meat Mafia podcast. We're really excited to have you on. The Meat Mafia is officially global. We've hit our second Australian guest, so this is a big deal for us.
Well, it's nice to know Australia is actually included in the global community now.
Oh yeah, you would have, Dr. Gery, you would have loved the first Australian guest that we had on. His name is Michael Kanza, and he did an Ironman fully fat adapted. So he wanted to prove that you could do these events quickly, fat adapted. And I think that he had 3 hard-boiled eggs for the entire race with water and sodium. And I think he did it in around 11 hours, which is pretty incredible.
I've got a tragic story about that one. There you are. Shakespeare was always about comedic tragedy. We could go off on that tangent. The very first dietitian that worked with us was a triathlete, and won't give her age away completely, but she was mid to late 20s and had hit her plateau. Couldn't actually go any. Just getting a bit sick, and training hard, but not getting the results. Anyway, she came to me and she said, "What do you think about low carb in management of diabetes?" And I said, "Okay, hey, how about we just start working together?" So that was the start of it. But she said she was a triathlete, so I gave her the book, The Art and Science of Low-Carbohydrate Performance by Steve Finney and Jeff Bolick. Short book. I recommend it to all athletes. And, it's only about 120 pages or something. And it talks about low carb, keto adaptation. So she read it, said the following day, said, "I'm going to do that." And 8 weeks later went and did a half Ironman and knocked 45 minutes off her time. So she came best time in the water, best time on the bike, best time on the run that she'd had in. So her career had plateaued. She then continued on that pathway and went to nationals and came 3rd in Australia at a full Ironman. And what a great success story. But the tragedy there is that she actually met another triathlete who lived in another state, fell in love, they've gotten married, and she left Tasmania and she left us. So, great sports performance, terrible romance from my point of view.
Wow. But 45 minutes is a significant amount of time to knock off of a half Ironman.
And that was in 8 weeks. So she did that. Well, maybe it was only 6, but she actually said, "I'm going to do that because I've got this half coming up." But then ended up just PBing all the way. And again, without the injuries, and the number of, I know we're right off on a tangent right from the word go, but if you look at heart problems in 40 to 40 plus year olds who have done a lot of sport in the past, and I'll throw myself in there. I had an atrial fibrillation, and I did an enormous amount of sport, hitting that wall, doing long distance running, long distance sport, and I actually think once you burn up all the glycogen in your body, then you've got to start burning protein to actually get glucose in the bloodstream. So therefore the body turns to skeletal muscle, but I think it also turns to cardiac muscle. So the great thing about keto adaptation is that you've got this enormous amount of fat stores on body. So it's way past the amount of fuel that you carry in your glycogen, 5-10 times as much. So you never actually get into that point of breaking down muscle or skeletal nor cardiac muscle. So those people, particularly in endurance sport, marathons and whatever, they get up the following morning and they're not sore. They haven't chewed up muscle, and that's the concept of that soreness after a marathon is common, but because of skeletal muscle, my concern is that whole group have actually been causing damage to their cardiac muscle, which then manifests itself as the heart arrhythmias in their 40s and 50s. And not many people are talking about that. It's one of those conversations that you have behind doors saying, "Hey, what do you think about this cardiac muscle?" Because when you start chewing up muscle, when you hit the wall and you run out of glycogen, I don't think our metabolism differentiates really well between skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle.
It's really interesting. That was his exact takeaway, that he was not sore or nearly as sore after that race. This is Kanza, who I'm speaking of, who did that. So That's an interesting anecdote.
But that's repeated over and over and over. Those people who are doing this are recovering better. They're training better. They're training easier. They're not having the injuries. And we can talk about the role of carbs and tendonitis and cartilage as well, as we go along today.
Absolutely. If we get along is the key question. I mean, we are the meat mafia, but we think you're an honorary Don of the meat mafia. So this is, but
well,
for,
we can do a sacrifice later. Okay.
Yeah. Harry and I like to do a baptism by bone broth. So Dr. Brian Lenskis loved that. So if you'd be interested in that too, that's what we normally like to do for our high priority guests.
Okay, we'll give it a crack.
No, but in all seriousness, this is a very big deal for us to have you on. A lot of your work has been foundational to both of us in our nutritional journeys. We've both had a lot of success leveraging, a low carbohydrate diet. And we know that your background is 25 years as an orthopedic surgeon, which started to lead you down this low carbohydrate approach to nutrition. I think as a starting point, I think we would love to give our audience just some more insight into your background and, really how did those orthopedic surgeries help push you towards this low carbohydrate approach to diet and nutrition?
I think it's pretty obvious that in the last few decades, the last 40 or 50 years, we've actually, the failed social experiment of the food pyramid has made us fatter and sicker. And there's a statement of mine where you say, if you eat by the food pyramid, you'll die by the food pyramid, and along the way you'll look like it. And that's pretty well what's happened. So, but in my practice, it's now over 30 years, the patients are getting fatter and sicker, heavier. There's more load on joints, more inflammation. But the pointy end of the stick for me was the diabetes foot problems. And in northern Tasmania, I was looking after most of the diabetic foot problems because nobody else wanted to do it. My registrars actually gave me a golden toilet brush as a Christmas present one year because they said, well, your job is to clean up everything which everyone else doesn't want to do. So I've still got that. Well, I've sitting in the cupboard behind there, but I actually think that's a trophy, a golden toilet brush.
Yes.
So, but the long and the short of it is I got the worst patients. And, from a healing aspect point of view, my clinics used to be called Fettke's effed up fructose-free fungating foot folly Fridays. But I don't know what the effed up stood for. So, and so we would literally every Friday have these patients coming in with rotting flesh. And I had those patients coming in, and then I have to bring them into hospital, have to trim a bit of their foot, trim a bit of their toes, and then, regularly have to do some amputations. And one of these guys was in hospital in his 40s, threatening to have to amputate both of his legs. And I did a ward round, and he was eating ice cream. And I went, this is the aha moment for me. I said, what are you eating ice cream for? He said, I'm told I'm supposed to eat ice cream. So he's got out of control diabetes, sugar, blood sugars that are through the roof, and he's being told to eat ice cream. So then I started making my inquiries, and he was having ice cream 3 times a day. And when you actually said, I challenged then the food system in the hospital food, the dietitians said, well, hang on, where does this come from? And they said, it's the guidelines. And then so I tried the reform within the hospital. That only upset the dietitians because I'm saying this doesn't make any sense. And then I was starting to talk about the roles of sugar. I then got on social media. Within 24 hours, pretty well, I became targeted by someone associated with the sugar sweetened beverage industry. We'll just leave it at that. Did I say Coca-Cola? And they come after me again, guys. You kept on doing it. So but anyway, the long and the short of it, I became targeted by that industry. And we've got documents that are the cereal industry, the breakfast cereal industry. So Belinda and her searchings came across these documents that said cereal sales are down in Australia and New Zealand. And this was presented to the big players, which include Kellogg's, Sanitarium here, Freedom Foods, Nestle, same big players that are around the world. Mm-hmm. And their minutes said cereal sales are down because of the concepts of low-carb, keto, paleo, and that these people are to be targeted. And I was one of 7 people on that list, and the only doctor. the only Australian doctor to be targeted. So I came under pressure from within my hospital, within the system. I ended up being reported 3 times to the medical board because of my stance. Each time we were able to track that back down to dietitians who were associated, or their association being funded indirectly by the cereal industry. I was charged that I was no longer able to give nutritional advice to my patients, particularly around sugar, even if it was shown to be best practice into the future. So we fought hard to try and overcome that. I went through 3 Senate inquiries. That's like no different to Senate inquiries in the US. I was a test case for that. And ultimately, after nearly 5 years, I was cleared of all those charges, exonerated, and apologised to. But it was critical for my case to win. It was critical for Tim Noakes in South Africa to win, because Tim and I have become really very good friends. Annika Dahlqvist in Sweden to win her situation, because all 3 of us came under significant pressure from our medical boards to be silenced. As it turns out, behind that, each one of those cases were dietitians that were directly involved with the food industry, their sponsorship, and interestingly, were able to track down the people that reported who were involved in it all actually knew each other across different countries. So by opening up the fact, by being cleared of charges, it meant actually that healthcare professionals, particularly doctors, could now talk about nutrition, and particularly talk about the perils of sugar, the perils of processed food, because all of a sudden, instead of just becoming, the people that were allowed to talk were dietitians who were actually, they didn't even realise they'd been completely corrupted by the food industry. But it just literally opened the floodgates for doctors to start talking about it openly, and that it was, that was our stubbornness trying to do the right thing and clear my name was actually the critical part in it. So, and then, but to clear my name, Belinda came into that equation, and she said, "Look, myself, Tim Noakes, everyone around the world, a lot of people you've interviewed, we're all talking about the science, and it's a no-brainer, and you can turn around diabetes." One of the times I got reported to the medical board because I inappropriately reversed someone's diabetes.
Inappropriately, though.
Inappropriately, got him off 7 medications in 12 weeks. Unfortunately, did it on public TV. So, that because it became public that we could actually turn diabetes around. And it was a 3-way competition. The Saving Australia diet. It was myself with a patient, Michael Mosley, who a lot of people will know, who's from the United Kingdom. He had a patient who was doing the 800 calorie, and against a dietitian, and both Michael and my patient, absolutely beat the dietitian's patient, which didn't look good on TV because that was, the normal pathway didn't work effectively. So a lot of us are talking about the science. We're talking about the practical aspect of it at n equals 1. Here's one person, here's another person, here's another person. Here's the data showing the benefits of low-carb, keto, reducing processed food. But nobody was listening to that, and we're going nowhere. So Belinda's work was to actually start searching as to actually who's behind this misinformation. And we call it generational education. If you actually realise that you believe your teachers and you believe their teachers, our teachers believe their teachers, and so that therefore there have been vested interests shaping our dietary guidelines since October 1917, and there have been pharmaceutical industries shaping our medical guidelines since 1910. So therefore, there's no one pretty well alive at the moment who was actually there at that point in time to actually give clarity. But it's all there in historical documents. So dietitians prescribe sugar and carbs and grain, that old food pyramid stuff, based on a belief that that's actually got science behind it. Well, in fact, it doesn't have science behind it. It's got religious ideology. So the whole vegan movement don't realise that they've become foot soldiers for the food industry. And the food industry is, I'm bringing it into a nutshell. You've got to have a chat to Belinda about this. She can go down all the rabbit holes. But the Seventh-day Adventist Church, not large in number, but huge in influence, are behind the whole lot. So you'd be surprised to know that the Seventh-day Adventist Church are the second biggest educator in the world after the Catholic Church. And you guys would know all about the Catholic Church and the Mafia. But they're the second biggest educator in the world. They're massive contributors to developing nations. They effectively started and owned the cereal industry. They started the Western soy industry, and they're right there behind the alternate meat industry. And they were right there. John Harvey Kellogg was the first person to develop meat analogues back in the late 19th century. And so they're right there behind those huge movements. But they're also the ones that started the American Dietitians Association. They wrote the textbooks for the next 40 years, which then shaped the education of dietitians worldwide in the Western world. So the American Dietetics Association formed the basis of the Canadian, the British, the Australian, New Zealand, South African. And so that influence, and the woman who started that American Dietetics Association, Lena Cooper, was actually working with John Harvey Kellogg and the Kellogg's group and that whole cereal industry right from the word go. We've got their textbooks, their original ones from the 1920s, and it's there. That you wouldn't believe it. They are vegan, vegetarian textbooks based on religion, not on science. You know, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. That was actually made up by the industry to start promoting that whole breakfast cereal. It wasn't based on anything. But it is based on something, because breaking the fast is actually an important meal. But breakfast in the morning so you can have a bowl of cereal was commercialized. And when you realize the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they're basically a vegan religion. They say they are anyway. It's quite interesting how when you actually determine their literature as to what they define as vegan and vegetarian. So there's a little tangent we can zip off on. So in the literature, often the Adventist health studies are quoted over and over and over hundreds of times as being proving the benefits of the Adventist lifestyle, which is vegan vegetarian. The definition of vegetarian is if you don't eat meat more than once a week. Hang on. And the definition of veganism is if you don't eat meat more than once a month. So that's not that they're not eating meat.
Right.
Interesting. So that's the original definition? So sorry to cut you off, Dr. Gery.
Yeah, that's their ongoing. You know, when you actually look at how they do their studies, their literature, that's how you get defined.
Do they give any reasoning as to why that's their definition? Is it rooted in some sort of thought?
No. That's just that's the problem is so therefore they're preaching this veganism based on the fact that essentially when the world's population has actually moved towards vegan, or actually has heard about it or understood it and actually wishes to do it, then Christ will return for the salvation of the Adventists. Now, all of this sounds completely bizarre, but it's Belinda's. You know, it's been fact checked. In fact, the Seventh-day Adventist Church have published an article in a journal called Religion 2019, where they actually talk about all of this. The fact that they are manipulating the dietary guidelines because that's what they believe in. They believe in this pathway, but you know, it's not only did they talk about it all, in the references is Belinda's work. They actually reference her as actually knowing more about what they're doing than what they know themselves. And so it's not, you know, I often say there's a talk I've given, it's not on YouTube or anything, about where's the best spot to hide something. You guys know that?
In plain sight?
In plain sight. And so therefore, once you start looking at it, it's there. They're not denying anything. You know, they're not denying that they've got placed people. They've been generationally working towards people being placed very high in the World Health Organization. Within the Polynesian countries here, I think it's half a dozen of the prime ministers and presidents are Seventh-day Adventists. You know, and this is huge. The Polynesian countries, it's called the blue Pacific, the blue continent. They have the highest rates of obesity and diabetes in the world. And they've got a huge push from religious ideology and the food industry to move them away from their natural ancestral diets towards cereal and grains, which they import, which is just crazy because they've already got diabetes, they've already got obesity, and they're just being pushed to travel. I've done foreign aid work there, and if you can get rice and packaged food and seed oils, it's just cheap. You can buy Coca-Cola, you can buy soft drinks there cheaper than you can in Australia. Like it's cheaper to buy soft drink, and it's just a tragedy to see a whole indigenous population succumbing to this, because that's what the food supply is in the market. So the markets, the food in the market is more expensive than it is in a supermarket. So you've got these open air markets you walk through and you buy your local produce, but it's cheaper for the local people to actually go to the supermarket and buy the garbage. And then it's just a tragedy unfolding. But behind it is an influence at a governmental level, which has been influenced by a religious organisation, which spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year into supporting this whole process based on ideology.
Are they the same group who's started the Garden of Eden diet? Is that the same?
Yeah, Garden of Eden diet, fruits, nuts, and grains. Not even vegetables. It's a really interesting. I mean, that's how that's the Garden of Eden diet: fruits, nuts, and grains.
Interesting.
So if you're a vegetarian, in effect, you're actually breaking the golden rule. And if you actually think about it, at the biochemistry, which is what I keep coming back to, I'll talk about the biochemistry of what we're eating and food and how it affects health. Belinda's got all the background on the vested interests which have been shaping those guidelines. So if you come to me and you're a vegan, I go, okay, that's fine. I'm happy. I'm very happy for you, because you've actually taken an interest in your health outcome. You've taken an interest in the environment. I think you're wrong, but you've taken a personal interest in it. So now I go, okay, now I know you're on that journey, but you now need to decipher what was the misinformation that's led you to be in that position. Right. So it's like if you're a dietitian and you're prescribing the food pyramid to patients, or you're prescribing supplements. Okay, I understand that you do that, but now I know where your education went wrong. And the same thing goes with the medical profession. I've given a talk, which is on YouTube, called "The Failure of Medical Education," and I refer so many healthcare professionals say, just go and watch that to work out how you've actually had been miseducated. Because when you realise that your education's been screwed up, then you can move forward. And you guys have had an email from me that says science evolves by being challenged, not by being followed. That's my byline. And until we just have to keep doing that. But so many people just don't question. They just follow suit. They just do what I call it. They're sheep rather than shepherds. Now that it's. And we can't have too many shepherds, I understand that. But I mean, the vast majority of the medical profession are just following guidelines, following suit, band-aiding sick care, not actually seeing the benefits
Dr.
of
Gery,
what they should be doing.
Does this fall into your definition of generational education, where there's this feedback loop or this cycle where one generation teaches the next, and then you don't really get out of any of the misinformation, so to speak?
But you're not rewarded for, you are rewarded for continuing the generational education. That's called read, repeat, reward. Universities 20, 30 years ago, I was probably the last bit of that. You were there to question. But now, junior school, high school, college, universities, read, repeat, reward. Get your degree. I can guarantee, it's the path least travelled, where you do question the authorities, is much harder.
Yeah.
For me, travelling this pathway, it's only cost me money. by me educating my patients, takes time, so you decrease your throughput. Your patients get better without you operating, so you don't make as much money. You guys will know Sean Baker, as an orthopedic surgeon. Sean got into trouble because his practice wasn't earning as much money. He was actually, his patients were getting better without him operating. Right. I've got a mate who's a shoulder surgeon in Queensland, and he's effectively stopped operating because he actually says to his patients, I'm going to book you for surgery in 6 weeks' time, but I want you to go low carb, keto, carnivore between now and then. And 3/4 of his patients actually cancel their surgery.
Wow.
Incredible.
And I've got the same stories with osteoarthritis of the knee, completely clapped out, worn out knees, where if they had have seen my colleagues, with respect to my colleagues, they would have had knee replacements. And they've said, is there anything else we can do? And not all of them were overweight. And I said, okay, look, here's the role of diet and inflammation. So with osteoarthritis of the knee in particular, we've got good studies that came out of China in 2020. So not everything bad came out of China in 2020, okay? Good, yeah. Great study. Was that if you actually eat carbohydrate, it was actually done with insulin. So when you increased your insulin, you increased inflammation in the knee, osteoarthritis of the knee. When you reduce the inflammation, this is human studies, you reduce the inflammation. Really neat studies, really looked at it nicely. And when you look inside the cartilage of a worn out joint, you find the end products of carbohydrate metabolism, of glucose metabolism. You don't find the end products of protein metabolism or fat metabolism. You don't even find where. You actually find the end products of glucose metabolism. So that when you reduce insulin levels, the inflammation settles. When you increase insulin levels, the inflammation gets worse. So extrapolate that to the patient. So, okay, stop eating sugar and carbs. You will naturally reduce the insulin you're secreting. And there was 1 week in particular where I had 8 people come back to me that I'd put on this low carb concept 6 or 8 weeks before, all bare bone in their joints. And all 8 of them had said they had no pain. They hadn't lost, a couple of them had lost a few kilos, a few pounds, but the vast majority of them hadn't lost any weight, had felt infinitely better, and they all had bare bone in their joints. Wow. Now, that doesn't mean that we haven't cured the problem, but we've delayed a significant intervention whilst they've taken on some lifestyle changes.
Dr.
Garry,
go ahead.
I was going to say, if we were to almost flash back 10 years ago, around like 2010, when you first started getting into the low carb approach and you were performing these amputations on patients, which is effectively a death sentence from what I understand. I've heard that. I think it's like the medium time after an amputation is 3 years. Is that correct?
About that. Yeah.
About that. So what information did you come across that made you effectively change your tune and realize that there's something to this low carbohydrate approach to nutrition?
Oh, look, it was a transition. I mean, the very first thing, the moment was, why are you giving this person ice cream? So the patient, literally, once you start realizing, okay, the patient's actually only doing what they're told.
Right.
They're actually taking the advice. They come into hospital, they're fed hospital food. They're presuming that hospital food is actually healthy, so they actually take that home and they go home and eat it. I gave a presentation to the hospital food industry, and my second slide was hospital food is crap and it's killing my patients. That was investigated by the medical board because they investigated everything, and they went to the hospital to find out exactly how many people actually died from hospital food. And the medical administration, in their wisdom, said, well, actually, none of Dr. Fettke's patients have died from hospital food. Wow. So it's a figure of speech. If you teach them, then if you teach the wrong thing, it's going to catch up over time. So the definitive metabolism of fructose was only described by Luc Tappy in 2010. So virtually everyone's textbooks don't have anything about fructose metabolism, or they have 1 or 2 lines, fructose to fructose 6-phosphate. They just don't say what happens to it. So therefore, most of it, health professionals don't even know about fructose metabolism because it hasn't even reached the textbooks yet, let alone, and the universities. So for me, it was, let's just stop eating sugar. And let's, for the person with diabetes, stop eating sugar. And then it was a journey. and you've got to sort of be very sympathetic to Belinda here, because I'd come home, I said, actually, we've all got to stop eating sugar. And for me, I stopped eating sugar. I'd actually cut my leg on a log in the bush. And I cut my leg and I had to actually take it pretty quiet. I read a book about sugar, and we were talking about it by David Gillespie here, called Sweet Poison. I was heading down that pathway, read the book. So I stopped eating sugar, lost 8 kilos by sitting on my backside for 6 weeks with a cut leg. I said, hang on, that doesn't make sense. So I didn't exercise, didn't change what I ate apart from stopping the sugar, still lost 8 kilos. What's that? That's 18, 20 pounds.
Yeah.
So from there I said, I blended, okay, we've got to get rid of all the sugar. This is bad stuff. And then I started realizing the role of seed oils, polyunsaturated oils, in the inflammation process. And then I said, actually, we've got to get rid of the seed oils. Okay, all that food. So it's like, at that time I said, it's okay, we can have potato chips, crisps, because it's got no sugar in it. And then I said, actually, we can eat potato crisps because we've got to find ones that aren't cooked in a seed oil.
Yes.
And then I started working out about the whole role of carbohydrates. So I'm very proud of it. It was at 2013. I said the nutritional model of inflammation. The very first description that modern disease is actually based on inflammation, and there's a model of it, and it's actually the combination of fructose, refined carbohydrate, and seed oils. So you've got, again, coming back to where Belinda was, I said, okay, now we've got to get rid of all the carbs in the house as well. And so she said to me, if you go into my kitchen pantry and take one more thing out, if you take the bacon away, that's it. So you guys are, it's nice and simple for you, because, I've gone through that experimental phase and of course, and sort of said, okay, here it is. It's really simple. If we eat fresh, local, seasonal, whole food, then it is low carb. It is no seed oils in it. It's no sugar in it. And that's actually what low carb keto is. But you have to bear with me that, bear with Belinda in particular, and over 10 years, over those first few years, we were working it out, because the papers weren't there. Well, in fact, the biochemistry was there. It just hadn't been pieced together. And all we did was be involved in, it's like, we're not giants. We just stood on the shoulders of others and put the jigsaw together. And that's where it's at. So nowadays it's really easy for people to go cold turkey. Okay, I'm going to actually do the whole lot. I'm going to give up the sugar, the carbs. I'm going to give up the processed food, the seed oils. I'm going to go through a bit of, withdrawal. I might get a bit of keto flu in that first, but, get through that hump and you'll start feeling a whole lot better pretty quickly. And you can start turning around people's health within days, if you've got type 2 diabetes and you go low carb keto, literally we can turn that around in 24 or 48 hours.
That's incredible.
And I do that regularly. There's, per chance we're talking, I was playing golf yesterday, because that's definitely a game of self-harm. And there was a guy I was talking to who's actually tried low carb keto in the past, and he's been effective, but he's fallen off the wagon. He said, can you help me again? I said, okay, we can help you again. And he literally just knows that he can actually get back on track again. So just by doing it.
Dr. Fettke, how many doctors do you think are out there in similar positions to you who are prescribing a pill versus prescribing a low carb approach to fixing diabetes? What would you estimate the breakdown to be?
Look, I'm still in the minority. Okay, I think it's over 99-1 against me at the moment still. Wow. But it used to be 0.1.
Right.
So it's, I think, when you say prescribing is one thing. To get your head around prescribing low carb keto means you've actually got to change your entire mindset. You've actually got to put on that holistic healthcare hat rather than the prescriber hat. It takes an enormous conscious decision to say, actually, I've gotten that wrong for the last few decades. And the medical profession on the whole are not very good at saying sorry.
Mm-hmm.
They are hopeless at saying, I got that wrong. And they find it very hard to admit that they might have prescribed harm. Belinda's described the last time we've actually ever said sorry as a health profession, as a medical profession, was thalidomide. Which, and she quoted the figure the other day, there's 12,000 documented cases of, children or babies being born without limbs. If there are 12,000 documented, there's infinitely more that were harmed. And so therefore, if you've in fact a medical professional, and including dietitians, and you have been prescribing harm by the food pyramid and just following the guidelines and recommending ice cream to diabetics, then infinitely more limbs have been lost as a result of that than thalidomide ever did. So we first of all, as a medical profession, have to accept it. That's why I come back to that talk about the failure of medical education. The very first time I gave that was to the national body of medical students, their annual meeting. And they had asked me to speak. And so there were half a dozen at the end of that who came up to me and said, well, what do we do now? I said, well, now you're armed with the information to know that your medical education has been manipulated. And so but the entire audience didn't come up to me and ask me why. What do we do now? I just had a handful of people. And that's what I keep trying to find. I trying to find the one doctor, the one person who's actually I get it, who's actually going to move forward with it. So literally, 10, 12 years ago, Rod Taylor in Melbourne invited me to come over and have a chat in his lounge room to a dozen people. And I look at that's low carb down under. You guys can, seen the low carb down under YouTube channel. Those talks have now been seen by tens of millions of people. And to think that started in one guy's lounge room is phenomenal. And Rod and I speaking just the other day again. So you remember, in the long run, nobody will ever remember us, Rod. But look at what you've done. That's. So how many doctors are prescribing it, Harry? Not enough. But how many are actually starting to say, actually, this isn't dangerous? There's more. And are we at the point of actually saying, okay, this becomes the first line management in health? We're not there yet, but it should be, shouldn't it? How you fuel your body should be the very first step before starting to give you medications and tablets to counteract this, that, or the other thing. We should be actually looking at the fuel going in first of all. I'm presenting to a group of endocrinologists at the end of this month, which I think could be descending into the fire pit. But nonetheless, my talk is really simple about sugar, carbs, diabetes. And then it's going to be open arms. So what are your concerns? Why aren't you prescribing this? I'm not going to say you have to. My body language might suggest otherwise. But so why aren't you? What are the concerns? And part of those concerns is a deep guilt that they might have gotten it wrong. Because none of us ever like to admit that we were wrong.
No.
None of us like to admit that we actually might be causing harm. Because that's not why people go into medicine. They go into medicine, most people go into medicine to try and do good. And it's an enormous step. But for me, it was just an outpouring. When I actually said, I got that wrong, I was able to move forward. I don't know if you guys have got kids, if you tell you educate your children when you say, actually, you've done wrong, just say sorry and we can move on. Why can't we do that as adults? That's what we've got to do. Okay, sorry, got that wrong. Let's address what we got wrong and move in this pathway. If you're traveling down the highway or the expressway, you've got all those signs saying you are going the wrong way. Right? The medical profession's just been ignoring those, and they just keep ploughing straight headlong into the ongoing traffic. Is it any wonder we've got a complete crashed up medical system? Just stop heading into the traffic. It's just wrong. I'm still amazed, that we haven't cottoned onto this earlier.
And that's where people like Dr. Tim Noakes are so admirable, right? Because correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure you know the history way better than I do, but I've heard that he was one of the original high carb advocates for endurance athletics. I think he legitimately wrote a book about that. And then I don't know if he ended up being pre-diabetic or overweight, but he started experimenting with a low carb diet, lost a ton of weight, and then just completely changed his tune. And to us, that seems like the true definition of science, being able to admit that you're wrong and being open to change to a new methodology to be able to help patients as much as possible.
You're pretty well right. I don't think Tim needed to lose a lot of weight, but he improved his metabolic health. And there's a great video of him somewhere on YouTube of actually tearing up his book. So the father of carb loading in sport has torn, literally torn. I've got trying to tear chapters out of his book. That's it. Once you admit you got it wrong, then you can move forward. The longer you keep trying to play cover up, whether or not you're doing it at a conscious level or an unconscious level, the more trouble you're getting into. You guys are on Twitter quite occasionally. When someone has a crack at me, sometimes I'll say, it's really important to put your shovel down. That you're just digging a deeper hole for yourself.
Right.
And so the more entrenched people get into this, we've got to eat by the food pyramid. We've got to, the whole vegan movement. If you're traveling that path of veganism, A, it's based on religion. B, eating a plant-based diet is going to be nutritionally depleted over time. It's incomplete protein, incomplete fats, incomplete micronutrients. So therefore, over time, if you are going to become malnourished, I'm sorry, but the Seventh-day Adventists have gotten around that because they have these cheat days where they actually get the meats back into their diet. And they also don't smoke, and they have a good sense of community, and some of their benefits of lifestyle are actually not just related to what they eat. But if you have an animal-based diet, particularly if you eat tip to tail, or nose to tail, and you eat that animal respectfully, when I say respectfully, it's respecting the animal and you're respecting the environment it's raised in, then you actually have a nutritionally complete. It's got a complete set of proteins, complete set of fats, complete set of micronutrients. None of us require carbohydrate. There's not a single biochemical pathway in the body that requires you to eat glucose or fructose. None. Again, I did that as an academic argument last year. What's the toxic dose of carbohydrate? We're talking that carbs are bad. So, at toxicity, I defined as when it has a negative impact on the system. And in my mind, again, I did it as an academic argument. 4 grams of glucose, 1 teaspoon of glucose is enough to actually have a negative impact on the system. So at 4 grams, one slice of bread has 5 teaspoons of glucose in it. So at 1 teaspoon, it starts affecting the glycocalyx, which is the lining of every blood vessel. It starts becoming elevated in our joints, particularly in our tissues, and it has an insulin response. And insulin is a fat storage hormone. It's a growth hormone for cancers, and it is an inflammation hormone. That's it. I've summarized an hour talk into that in 1 minute there. So we don't actually require glucose. And when we sleep at night without having glucose coming into the body, we can fast for days without carbs in the system. Animals, go into hibernation without glucose coming in. The body produces that tiny amount of glucose, which is required by a few cells. That's called gluconeogenesis. So we're completely primed to not be dependent on a seasonally available food. And the only natural glucose or natural carbohydrate around which is easily digestible is fruit and honey. Small amount in meat and small amount in breast milk. But and I say, look, and fruit's not seasonally available. Sorry, fruit's seasonally available. So I live in Tasmania. There's no fruit on the trees now. A few lemons that are out there. And fruit normally comes into season at the end of summer, beginning of autumn. which is just before winter. So animals, including ourselves, will stuff our faces full of fruit so we can get fat for winter hibernation.
Right.
So when you start looking at fructose, which is the fruit sugar, that actually drives behavior. It's got all these effects on the brain, the gut, to actually drive behavior to eat more and more and more. It's brilliant. It's a fabulous mechanism in survival, but we need that to get fat for winter hibernation. Well, all the supermarkets now are full of food. I mean, in Western society, nobody starves to death from a lack of food.
Mm-hmm.
They might starve to death at a micronutrient level from eating too much food that doesn't have it, doesn't have the micronutrients. But we're never short of calories. We're often short of nutrients. So the classic is, you can eat a pizza. Looks great, it gives so much fuel in it, but it's micronutrient. You haven't had the protein in it, you haven't had the healthy fats in it. You certainly haven't the micronutrients. So what do? We eat another one thinking, so we eat more food looking for our nutrients. We're not looking for more energy. I think it's another way of just reshaping. So I say, to people, eat for your nutritional requirements, not for your energy requirements.
Dr. Fettke, on that, on the fructose point, or on the, glucose point, what would you say to someone who says that your body creates glycogen for energy? Is that an argument that you care to break down, like where the difference between glucose and glycogen, and how your body does create some form of glycogen and it does store it and secrete it in some ways for energy?
Yeah, there is a very rapid, it's for that fright and flight response.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got all these defense mechanisms in our body for danger. So danger can be immediate, which is you need to run away from a bear, or the danger can be long-term, which is periods of fasting. Like literally no food is available. So you're a hunter-gatherer and no food's available. So the vast majority of time in evolution, food availability has been the greatest chronic danger. So our body's adapted to actually evolve in a state of intermittent fasting or fasting and seasonal food availability. Whereas glycogen is there in our muscle for that fright and flight response. So therefore that's when an athlete will run out of glycogen unless they've been keto adapted. So one of the things about keto adaptation in sport is if you're running along and you're just running on your fat fuel stores, you need to do a sprint at the end of that race or a cycling race. You've got all that glycogen still hanging around in the bloodstream, ready to go. That's the beauty of it. So yes, the body actually does like glucose for muscle in that sprint, in that fright or flight response. So but again, the body only stores enough to get you out of trouble. Like it's really like the most elite athletes have trained really hard to try and get their glycogen levels up a little bit. But it's really hard. So the amount of glycogen you can store in your skeletal muscle for exercise is pretty well limited. It's very hard to build that up. Where it's easy to flip over into keto and actually have an infinitely greater fuel source available. So I think glycogen is there. Glycogen is an immediate source of glucose, and it's readily available for your defense mechanism acutely. But it's not the best fuel for long-term management. And you can go down to we'll drift down the calorie concept. So a gram of carbohydrate is about there's 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate, whereas about 9 calories per gram of fat. So if you're going to run around, if you want to fuel your tank, and you've got to put a kilo of fuel in your body, would you rather have a kilo of carbohydrate in your body, or would you rather have a kilo of fat?
Mm-hmm.
So we've got, 4 grams per gram, 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate. You've got 9 calories. So, I mean, Dom D'Agostino is working with the Navy SEALs over there. Huge. I mean, that's a fascinating topic to actually get them to go keto adapted. The special services soldiers I've worked with here, there's not many of them, but they say when they go into battle, they actually go into keto, or when they go into combat and they go into training, and then they feel, when they're in that, they actually are feeling keener. They use the term keen. They go sharper. Their mental acuity has gone up, but their ability to actually, they can go further on less energy. And so if they carry in their packs, they're carrying food which is more fat than carbohydrate. They're actually carrying twice as much fuel on board.
Interesting.
Than if you're just having a block of chocolate.
Mm.
You got a kilo of pasta in your bag, or you got a kilo of, well, let's say meat or biltong. Quite clearly, you've got far more fuel on board. So again, that's a long-winded answer, which I'm known for. Sorry, Harry.
No,
That's a great answer. Dr. Gery, we were curious, do you have any recommendations for patients that are looking to maybe smooth that transition into ketogenic adaptation, just to make it a little bit easier? We've heard about things like making sure that your sodium levels are adequately stored, but is there anything else that you would recommend for someone thinking about making that transition to higher fat, low carb?
I call it healthy fat. So I call it low carb healthy fat rather than high fat. Because it's got connotations. Conflict of interest. I have a website called, I have the web address low-carb-healthy-fat.com, of which I've done nothing with it. But so
full transparency. I love it.
But no money, I just happened to. I worked out this years ago. I said, would everyone stop calling it low carb, high fat, because that just gives people it's a wrong transition to go to. I say we should be eating very little carbohydrate. I'm not a numbers person. People say, how many grams are you having of this, or how many grams? I said, don't worry. I have very little carbohydrate. I eat protein to requirement. So if you're growing, a lot of sport, or elderly, you need more protein per kilo. But you can work that out. Once you stop having sugar and carbs in your diet, your actually body will tell you. Like, I'll wake up and go, I think I need protein today. I think I need eggs and meat and that sort of thing. And then you eat your fat to satiety. So and some people say it's got to be 80% fat. And I say, no, it doesn't have to be fat. It doesn't have to be 80% or 70% or 60. What you do, so if I test my ketone levels, I'm in ketosis. I'm okay with it. I'm not trying to reach a number. So so therefore it's about a transition. So if everyone says, okay, I want to do this, I say, okay, well, let's start looking at what you're eating. And if you move down that pathway, and I call it, again, I'll come back to it, fresh, local, seasonal, whole food, based on your culture and environment, reducing added sugar and processed food. That's it. That's one sentence, describes what to eat. If we do that, people can either go hardcore and do everything in one hit, which is hard for a lot of people, and you need support. Or you can say, okay, I'm going to stop eating the seed oils. I'm just going to reduce that. And there's 100 tricks to help doing that. If your kidneys are functioning well, which is what it is for the vast majority of people, then add the salt, throw the salt on the food, taste. We've got this fabulous, the kidney is fabulous for getting rid of excess salt. It's fabulous for storing whatever salt we've got, but it's highly likely that we've actually gotten that salt one wrong as well. There's a great book called The Salt Fix by James D. Nicolatino. And James takes apart a lot of those myths, and I think it's a good starter read for people on that journey. But effectively, we're born out of if you believe in evolution, then we've been born out of the sea. We are salt-based. We're all about maintaining salt, but if we've actually on salt restriction, then you're going to struggle. So I say to people, and again, if you've got high insulin levels in your body because you've had a high carbohydrate diet, then you're going to have more water on board, more salt on board. Insulin's a salt retaining. So the very first thing, as you said, is get, rather than say to people, get your sodium levels right, so throw the salt on your food. Just sprinkle it over. It makes meat taste better anyway. Then keep your hydration up, a bit of exercise, and then start just thinking about eating for nutrition. Eat nutrient-dense food. And there's lots of sheets out there now saying, red food, yellow light food, green food. And they're all over the internet. And I say, look, just eat, again, you're going to eat the foods over here, and you're going to avoid the foods over here. Now, some people will do that hardcore. Some people will do it with varying degrees of success. But it becomes education. The trouble with most people is that they go out and dine with other people or dine with family, and who will undermine their confidence. And that's what, they'll say, oh, you're eating that, that's going to clog up your arteries. Are you going to do that? That's going to kill you. You're putting salt on your food. Oh my God, it's going to kill you. And so they're constantly having the rug pulled out from underneath them. So if you're going to do this journey, rather than the biggest trick is create a support mechanism around you. And there are plenty of low carb communities that can do that, whether or not it's a one-on-one, or do it with another friend, or do it with another support person, because that's the biggest trick, is to overcome all of the people that are going to try and undermine you. Because if you get better, and you lose weight and you feel healthier and you look great and blah, 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 then other people around you will start feeling guilty that they're not doing it. And if they're not doing it, what do we do in society? Tall poppy syndrome, we try and undermine that, because if they're doing it right, maybe I've been doing it wrong. It comes back to this whole thing of actually working out that whatever you've been doing might just be wrong. And so there's so much propaganda out there, whether or not we're talking about health and we're talking about environment. That's, cows causing climate change. What a load of literal cow poo.
Can you unpack that one a bit?
A plant-based agricultural sector requires tilling of the soil. And that tilling of the soil has created the greatest erosion problems. The greatest export in the agricultural sector for the last 2,000 years has been topsoil. The fall of the Roman Empire was actually related to their loss of topsoil. So we've been getting this wrong for thousands of years. So if you don't look after your topsoil, you don't look after you can't produce food. So the health of, to extrapolate one of Roosevelt's quotes, the health of society is related to the health of the people. The health of the people is related to the health of the food. The health of the food is related to the health of the soil. That's my extrapolation of it. So if you don't look after the soil, you're not looking at, you can't get to B to C to D. You just can't get there. So when you look at agricultural practices, and particularly cropping, then that actually tills the soil. And every time you till the soil, one tablespoon of dirt destroys the habitat of 7 billion creatures. So when you turn the soil over, you destroy the habitat of as many living creatures as there are people on the planet. Just a little number crunch. So therefore, and when you till the soil, then wind comes along, rain comes along, and you actually lose that soil. And therefore, we've reached peak fertilizer on the planet. That's a hump we've just gotten past at the moment. We don't have and it's just come to full bear in the recent Ukrainian thing that we lost 20% of the nitrogen available for fertilizer production in Europe just last week. So, and for millennia, farmers have fertilized their paddocks with animal manure. So the only thing that restores nutrition to the soil is ruminant agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
So cows, well, for example, cows, sheep, they eat grass. Grass is taken from CO2 in the atmosphere. They poo it out, puts nutrition back into the soil. And they talk about cows needing water. Well, in fact, they do. They drink water and then they pee it straight back out. It's just a conduit system. It's not as though they're using up truckloads of water in the production of a kilo of beef. Here's some little known facts. Lamb produces more methane per kilo than beef. In the animal kingdom, what's the biggest producers of methane? Counted to be somewhere between 25 and 30% of methane production on the planet from the animal kingdom comes from termites.
Really?
Termites, scarab beetles, millipedes, and cockroaches.
Wow.
So on the little tail of the termite is a little methane producing organisms, and they just produce more methane. So we don't hear the animal rights people, let's go and kill all the termites. Okay?
Right, the termites.
Yeah. Let's solve global warming by killing termites and cockroaches. I mean, it just, and I'm not into I'm not supporting factory farming and of animals, but we've got less than 4% of the planet's tillable soil, agricultural soil, can actually be done for plant-based agriculture, and let's utilize it appropriately. But then there's 20% of grasslands on this planet which actually can be farmed in a holistic sense with animal agriculture and their products, which actually restores nutrition to the soil. The only way of putting nutrients back into the soil is actually by animal agriculture. And the rotting of forests and in natural processes. Doing it chemically is crazy. I mean, when you put fertilizer on paddocks, it binds the magnesium. So the soils now are nutritionally depleted of magnesium. So therefore, the foods we produce don't have enough magnesium in it. So again, that's in fact the animals that come off those paddocks that have been heavily fertilized over years are magnesium depleted. The plants that are grown in fertilized paddocks are magnesium depleted. So one of the great problems in society is we've got a magnesium depleted food source. So the only supplement that I say to people you might want to be taking, apart from the salt, of the food, is that there is an argument for magnesium. That's probably the only one.
Yeah.
No, you're good, Gery. You're good.
Yeah, I was going to say the soil problem is a really interesting one, and I feel like it's one that's overlooked by people who are more of a proponent of vegan vegetarian diet when they talk about removing the cows from kind of the food system. In some ways, like, is that how you feel about it, or?
But most of the developing world requires their only source of protein, of good protein, is their locally farmed animal. They use it in a holistic sense. They use the animal manures to put into their local soils. And there's been good work on this, that when you actually put a little bit of animal protein back into the diets of children, and that work's primarily been done in Africa the last few years, their overall health improves dramatically. A lot of times, we talked about, look at, the Eastern cultures, the Hindus and whatever, and the Indians, they don't eat much meat. But then you can also look at that population and say they're the most iron deficient population in the world. They are struggling. Here's another one: elite athletes. Here in Tasmania, they've looked at the elite athletes, and I come to 3/4, 80% of them are iron deficient.
Wow.
because they're traveling this pathway of, oh, I can't eat meat.
Mm.
And so they're just addressing that. Okay, we just need to get iron into these people. And so the question is, do you give them iron infusions or do you give them real food? Complete no-brainer to me. But we've got this whole cultural thing which has just permeated our education, our media, our mainstream media, saying animals are bad for the environment, animals are bad for our food. But you've got to come back to, again, where did that come from? Well, the concepts of, we go back to the teachings of Ellen G. White, who was the prophetess of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. In the 19th century, late 1800s, meat causes violence, meat causes cancer, may have been cancer of the soul. Meat causes masturbation, because that's the most heinous sin you can ever do. And then we've moved down the pathway of meat causes heart disease, fat causes heart disease, and now that meat causes environmental damage.
Yeah.
When you track this back, this is all the teachings of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, who have been heavily involved in marketing for over 100 years of this message. And as I say, they're the second biggest educator in the schools, educator in the world. So that the whole thing about, and they've been writing the dietary guidelines for 100 years. This isn't based on science. And the side effect of that is now we have this society which is fatter and sicker. Traveling the path of more plant-based is not going to make the people healthier. I'm sorry, it's not going to do it. It might get them off a bit of garbage food, but over time it's going to catch up. And I'm seriously concerned about the environmental impact of a plant-based agricultural sector when we've only got 4%. And sure, we can actually improve the quantity of food over by putting genetically modified foods on it, if that's a good thing. But we don't have the fertilizer to do it unless we're going to start dragging fertilizer, the nutrients out of our air. And that's where the work's happening at the moment, to track nitrogen out of the air to try and make fertilizers. When we've actually got this other side culture, which is how we evolved on animal-based agriculture, on animal-based foods, which are complete for our nutritional requirements and complete from our environmental requirements. As to whether or not everyone on the planet will have access to that, that becomes a whole social political argument. But if we look at the biochemistry and we look at the nutrition and we look at the environment, at those basic levels, then animal-based agriculture, animal-based nutrition wins hands down. And maybe we don't have a sustainable population on this planet, and we can't look after 7 billion or 10 billion people. And maybe the only way we can do that is actually by supplying nutritionally depleted food. You guys seen Soylent Green?
Yeah.
Old Charlton Heston movie, terrible movie. But it was a cult movie in 1970, and it was set into the future. We watched it last year. I don't know if we can ever get that time back again, but anyway. So we watched it anyway. It's set in 2022. So again, it was 50 years ago, and that movie based in New York, and it was describing a society that actually that had moved down to just supplying the people with processed biscuits. Soylent Orange, Soylent Red, Soylent Yellow, and they'd run out of even at that, so they'd moved to Soylent Green, which was just recycled humans. But there's a great, like the most privileged person, put in their refrigerator, they had a piece of meat hanging there. The most privileged people had access to going sitting beside a tree. And so, gosh, it was pretty accurate. I realise it's somewhat dystopian to think about it, but I honestly don't think we have enough. That whole social political argument of how much population the world can sustain it's not going to be sustained if we travel the path of the plant-based agricultural one.
Yeah.
without massive supplementation. And the supplements have got to come from somewhere. And I can't. I was just thinking about this. Whilst we've got a small vegetable garden outside, and I've got a big cage around it and everything, and some animal still keeps getting in there and eating it all. Have you guys ever tried growing your own vegetables?
A little bit when I was younger.
When I was younger.
And you start with it's labor intensive. I always say to people, if you want to be vegan, vegetarian, okay, grow all your own vegetables.
Right.
Find out how hard it is, how much water you've got to put on it, and try and grow them without chemicals and things which kill other animals, to kill the snails and the bugs that get in there. It's really, really hard. Whereas out the paddock here, I've got sheep, which I make certain they've got water.
That's it.
Pretty low.
That's it.
Yeah. That's an amazing proof of work. And we're curious too, with all the research and observation that you've done, do you feel strongly, do you prefer regenerative grass-fed meat over conventional corn-fed beef? Or, how do you think about speaking to patients that might have questions on just the difference in meat quality?
Oh, look, we're very privileged here in Tasmania that we've got access to that fresh, local, seasonal whole food. Our meats are pasture-fed, pasture-raised. If you could look at the biochemistry, particularly the omega-6 fatty acid levels of meats, whether or not it's chicken, fish, beef, they are slightly higher in those in those meats that have been raised on grain feedlot, but they're still not very high. So if you've got a choice between eating pasture-fed animals raised in a holistic sense over a more commercially biased pathway, then of course you're going to travel that. It's going to be slightly healthier for you, it's healthier for the planet, and it's more holistic for the animal. But if you don't have access to that, of which most of the majority of the world's population don't, then okay, take what you can get because it's going to be nutritionally better for you. If we have people say, "Oh, you're eating all this, prime beef and prime lamb and whatever," and no, we're not. We actually have meatballs made from the cheapest mince, because the cheapest mince has got a higher fat content. So I say to people, don't go and buy the prime mince, which is dry, and then you've got to cook it in extra fat because it doesn't have the fat in it. Just buy the cheap mince. We have meatball Mondays here, which last till Thursdays. Now, there's a huge push for meatless Mondays. Well, we have meatball Mondays.
I love that. That is amazing.
And so our snack food is if I'm hungry and I got that I don't really get hanger anymore, but nonetheless, if you want a snack, there's a meatball in the fridge. There's a sausage in the fridge. We've again very fortunate. We've got great sausages here in Tasmania. So that you go to, or there's cheese in the fridge, or a biltong is my go-to. If I'm out and about, I've got a bit of biltong, which is beef jerky, not the high sugar ones which you can get in the US and commercially. You've got to go sourcing it. So if you ideally you want the best that you can get for the money you've got. But our daughter's done this work with actually dollar for dollar eating a low carb, keto, fresh, local, seasonal food versus what's recommended in dietary guidelines. It is not more expensive.
Interesting.
When you actually look at the pricing of it, it's not more expensive. If you want to go and make your cakes and biscuits out of an almond flour, and you want to keep eating those foods which you don't need, then it can be more expensive. But again, if it's no different in the US as it is here. 40% of people's food budget spent on discretionary food, of eating out. 40, 50, 60%. So most people are actually spending nearly half of their food budget on foods which are takeaway, which is generally poorer quality, lower nutrition, more expensive. But if you're actually cooking at home, which is an art form that's lost, then it's not more expensive. We've got another motto. So cook once, eat thrice. There's always leftovers in the fridge. So it's not about having to spend hours of cooking. Make certain there's enough there, or we've got a freezer full of food. So okay, we were going to cook. Our son and his wife, for years, they would actually cook every weekend, cook a heap of food, and then they'd put it in the freezer. And then the next weekend they'd cook a different food and have it in the freezer. So every night they were having different foods, but they'd cook them up weeks in advance. So the variety's there, and it's not more expensive. It's more expensive in time. So if you want to spend, I say to people, look, you're going to have to spend the time doing it now. You've got a choice of spending time getting fresh food, empty pantry, full fridge. That's a great one, empty pantry, full fridge, from Karen's Inn in New Zealand. But if you're going to have to spend your time preparing your food now, preparing it as a family like we used to do, eating around the table and communicating like we used to do. But you've got a choice of spending that time now or spending that time in my waiting room in the future. And becoming what I call it's a medical tourist. So many people are medical tourists now. What are we doing this week, darling? Oh, we're going to the doctor. We're going to have an X-ray. We're having a blood test on Wednesday. We're seeing the physio on Thursday. What are we doing next week? Oh, you've got to see that, blah, blah, blah. That medical tourism industry is just massive. And I've been part of it for decades. And most people are part of that sickness industry. We need to turn it back into a health system.
Dr. Fettke, I can't help but be inspired by your ability to stand up in the face of a lot of criticism from your peers and kind of the institution itself. Did you did you find your courage in seeing that medical tourism happening and seeing all these people who are just in these terrible positions?
I didn't realize until only a couple of years ago that I probably owe a lot to my mother and grandmother. My mother died when I was a teenager. My grandmother, I think I met her once. I've got a couple of pictures of seeing her. But they were massively involved in social justice. My mother immigrated from Germany via South America to here. My grandmother, I only found out a couple of years ago. My uncle died. We went to Germany just before I gave the CrossFit talk in 2017, 2018, which is that first time that I brought Belinda's work to the forefront. I said, I'm not going to get up in the Midwest in the US and let you speak about religion and nutrition. I'll do that, and I'll take it for the team. But it was a lot of her work. So that's, again, CrossFit, Fettke, the central role of nutrition and everything, where I do talk about the environment and politics and education. That was very much the very first outpouring of Belinda's work. Anyway, we're on that trip, and the long and the short of it, my grandmother was one of the very few women who stood up against the Nazis and was standing up in beer halls denouncing them. And she was a Jewess and ended up moving to South America, and at the end of the war going back to Germany and opening up 8 orphanages. Now, I didn't know about that. So she was the matriarch of social work for Southern Germany. And my mother had that same spirit in her, and I'm pretty, so it's interesting how that I didn't even know that spirit was there. But social justice has been part of that, and same thing goes with Belinda's family. So, and the other thing is, if you actually take the Germanic meaning of Fettke, it's the key to fat. So maybe I was destined by surname just to actually to be on this pathway. I didn't know it. I was born into it.
That's destiny.
And again, you don't actually realize this when you're on the journey, and you only look back and go, I didn't really have any choice, did I?
Yeah, that's amazing.
Dr. Gery, were there any unintentional benefits of that trial that maybe you didn't realize at the time, but now looking back at it 4 to 5 years later that have maybe occurred as a result of that trial?
Belinda and I are very close. Our family's very close. It was, whilst all this is going on, and there was a lot of stuff happening in you drive down the street and the front headlines, of our local newspapers, had me across it on a couple of occasions. I can't even remember what it was, whether Dr. Sugar, Fettke Sugar, something like that. We're a smallish community of a couple of 100,000 people, so that was hard on the family. Every Christmas we'd sit the family down and say, "How are you guys going?" And because just to check on them, and it was. I can remember one year our son said, "Oh, look, I've been pretty hard on you, but I reckon they can go harder." That's what sons are like.
Yeah.
He said, "I reckon you two are resilient. They can go harder at you." What a fabulous journey that Belinda and I have been on to actually be able to actually help others. And I don't know, that sounds really corny, but it's been an amazing journey. One of my proudest moments is actually Low Carb USA, in San Diego a couple of years ago, where we were invited to come and speak. There's a couple of Tasmanians, a couple of state school educated kids from the other end of the planet, and Belinda was asked to open Low Carb USA, and I was asked to be the second last speaker before Garry Taubes. And I thought, wow, Belinda and I are part of this community, because it's a community.
It is.
Been welcomed into it. But to actually share the podium, and we've spoken at talks together, to see us both recognised for what we're doing, and that's a awesome sort of spot to be in a relationship. And she's fabulous, and she's much nicer than me. So you guys have got to have a chat to her.
Yeah, we look forward to talking to her, and I know she's got a lot of the details behind some of the stories that you've already alluded to a bunch as a relation to nutrition and religion, which I personally find it so fascinating. I think that being able to peel back the onion and really understand what's being told to you and why it's being told to you really helps you realize like what's happening in the present day world. Like why are we such a sick and unhealthy world? Why do 88% of people in the Western world have metabolic dysfunction? You can go back to a number of different things, which we're definitely excited to have her on. I was actually curious, before we started talking, I mentioned I was listening to you on Paul Saladino's podcast, and you mentioned a story about Battle Creek, Michigan, which I think is where a number of different cereals were made.
Yeah, virtually all of them. 101 cereal companies started there.
Why is that? Why Battle Creek, Michigan, and what's the whole story with Battle Creek, Michigan?
Oh, I think Belinda will be able to do it far, far better than me. But effectively, John Harvey Kellogg and his brother William Keith started the breakfast cereal, the cornflakes, and they started the industry there. Battle Creek, Michigan is the home of the Adventist Church. And as I say, 101 cereal companies started there around the turn of that late 1896 to 1902, something like that. Virtually all owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and over decades they've come down to being, a far smaller number. But they were effectively started in Battle Creek, Michigan. The entire cereal industry, the whole concept, that marketing of everything starts in Battle Creek, Michigan. But you've got to come back to William. Why did he actually develop the breakfast cereal? And that's the fascinating one. And breakfast cereal was invented to stop us from masturbating, to quell our lustful thoughts. It was a bland food to actually quell that lust. And so it was a food served as a gruel to actually stop. When you go to the Battle Creek Sanitarium, which was run by John Harvey Kellogg, started again under that whole umbrella. The basic, the cleansing of the soul, the cleansing of the being, the health of the being, one of them was to actually, because the vilest sin was to masturbate. So therefore, they were right into the bowel cleansings, the bowel washouts, the vegan food, the vegetarian food, that blandness. But again, so a lot of times we blame Ansel Keys for a whole lot of issues that happened in the mid 20th century, but you've got to actually work out what was influencing him in the 20th century. And a lot of his early studies on starvation were done on the conscientious objectors. And the conscientious objectors were Seventh-day Adventists because they didn't go to war. So therefore, we don't know that. We don't know how much influence, but he would have been doing a whole lot of work with that community. So maybe a lot of Ansel Keys' thoughts actually came from working with the Seventh-day Adventists. But you've actually got to work out where the Adventists, the whole cereal industry, really interesting, Battle Creek, Michigan, and the whole masturbation sort of thing. But how come John Harvey Kellogg invented it? So you've got to go back in his history to realise at the age of 12, he was living with Ellen G. White's family, the prophetess, and he was typesetting as a 12-year-old her writings. And her first book was about masturbation and the evil side of it, and you'd spend all eternity in hell if you masturbated. So imagine being a 12-year-old in the mid-19th century, typesetting this book under this umbrella of the first family, how much he was brainwashed into believing that. And then he was married, and they adopted multiple children, apparently didn't consummate their marriage. But so therefore, have we all gotten fat and sick and metabolically unwell? I know this is a long bow I'm drawing, because of a 12-year-old typesetting stuff in the mid-19th century. And maybe we have, because the flow-on effect is that he was so influential in development. So the Battle Creek Sanitarium became the model of all Western big hospitals, massive institutions, multiple levels, multiple departments. So the Battle Creek Sanitarium became the model of Western medicine delivery. So it's all, again, how did we get, we're here now, we have our preconceptions that make up our beliefs. And I think it's just fascinating to break that down in history to work out what we're doing right now. And as it turns out, so much of us, our medical education, our nutritional education, all starts between 1850 and 1917. And as there it is. And so therefore, again, generational education. And we do what our parents told us to do. We eat what our families ate. But it's, based on availability and knowledge.
It's so important too, and this stuff is not a conspiracy theory, right? Especially Harry and I wrote a Twitter thread on John Harvey Kellogg that got a lot of traction, and people thought that we were just telling some conspiracy theory until they actually started doing the research and seeing some of the very disturbing public quotes that John Harvey Kellogg had said about sex and masturbation and all the topics that you were just talking about. And it is incredibly important to peel back the onion when Kellogg's is doing $4 billion a year in revenue, and they're doing all this very targeted marketing on these sugary, refined grains to our children, and parents are brainwashed into thinking that's a healthy food, and breakfast is the most important meal of the day. It's important to understand where all of this stemmed from as a product to quell masturbation and sexual urges. So, right
here in Australia, we've got the documents from the Australian Breakfast Cereal Manufacturing Forum. Okay, that's the group that we've got those documents. They're internal emails, and Blinder's not a hacker. They literally just fell out of the internet, and in it is the paid sponsorship by the cereal industry. I'm talking about Kellogg's, Sanitarium, Nestle. They were paying the Dietitians Association here in Australia to promote promote and defend the benefits of sugar and cereal to the Australian population. So the dietitians are the ones writing the dietary guidelines. There was one paid sponsorship They didn't have any other paid sponsorships. And the one thing they had was the cereal industry was paying the Dietitians Association of Australia to promote the benefits of sugar and cereal to the Australian population. Now, if that isn't criminally corrupt on our health outcomes as a society, then I don't know what is.
Yeah.
But then again, Kellogg's have got their profit in mind, both of them, their dollar profit and their original profiteers. And here we have it's still our health outcomes are largely being determined by a major church organisation which is not paying taxes, certainly not here in Australia. So they've got religious freedom. So all that money that instead of paying taxes, they're putting into medical education, because medical education is seen as the right arm of the church as a entering wedge. And the amount of work they're doing in the developing world, fascinating. They've got, we have an admiration about how well they've done it.
It's
incredible. And as I say, they're not denying it. They're actually openly admitting it. But literally, it's what a fabulous business model. But they've been working at it hard for over 100 years, and now we're just playing catch up.
Dr. Fettke, I hate to ask this question to you an hour and a half into an interview, but it just seems like the incentives there are so broken. And it maybe ties to what we were talking about before we hopped on, which is these movements start from the ground up to really reclaim our health in a lot of ways. I mean, I think if you're healthy, the odds are a handful of people, family, friends who are unhealthy. How do you think we get there? Because it seems like there's just so much work to do in terms of turning this around.
Well, there isn't. There's first of all, lead by example, number one, and invite people into your house and feed them. When our daughter got married, most people said, "Oh, the food's fabulous." They didn't realise that had a low carb keto wedding ceremony. There was a wedding cake there, which wasn't small. I insisted there was also cheesecake on the side, so that literally made of cheeses, so I could actually eat some. But literally, you lead by example, number one. If you're waiting for guidelines to change, you're waiting for governments to change, you've got to realise that those guidelines and those governments are shaped by corporate sponsorship. The whole ideological guideline, so it doesn't come down. The whole thing isn't just about money. Everyone says follow the money, and the money is huge. But when you realise there's a religious ideology driving that whole church belief, which are highly positioned, are not realising they're doing it for salvation. They will go through an enormous amount of hardship to push this message because it's their salvation for eternity. And I'm not making it up. It's quite fascinating. But the most important thing is, if you're as an individual, you have the choice to decide what you eat this afternoon or not eat. And so you can make a decision for your health benefit based on what you eat and don't eat starting today. And reaching out in a podcast or something like that is just let's keep the message going. And there was, I don't know if you know, the two keto dudes who had a podcast, and they started that years ago. I didn't realize, but they actually started that after one of them came along to one of my talks and said, "Hey, and he then rang up the other guy in the US and said, "Hey, this is really important. How about we start to talk about it?" And their message was that every person who comes to listen, they should encourage 2 people to come and listen. And so therefore, hey, I've heard this. You tell 2 people, I've heard this. And then hopefully that's 2 people, then tell another 2 people. We can almost finish up on this concept of committed sardines. Have you ever heard of them?
No.
It's a phenomenon in the animal kingdom. And you know what I'm talking about, because a school of fish can turn like that. They can literally turn around.
Yeah.
And that that phenomenon is called a committed sardine. I don't know why it's called it, but anyway, that's a school of sardine. So if you get a sperm whale, massive, to turn at 180 degrees takes around 3 to 5 minutes. It can't to do a U-turn. But a school of fish, the size of a sperm whale can turn like that, flick.
Wow.
So the question is, what percentage need to turn the whole school around? So at any point in time in a school of fish, there's fish swimming in the opposite direction, and then they get turned back, that are more aware of danger, more turning back. And in fact, the critical mass isn't 50% to turn the school of fish around. It's not 20%, it's not 10%, it's 3%.
Really?
Now, all you need to do is 3%. And this is where the vegans are well aware of this. They keep advertising that they've got 3% of the population.
Wow.
They've got 3% of the population on board. That's why it's gaining momentum.
Yeah.
It's totally irrational. So here we've just only got to commit 3% of the people to actually go along and eat real food. And so the vast majority of the population are eating fresh, local, seasonal. The vast majority, let's say, of the non-Western world are eating fresh, local, seasonal, whatever they can get their hands on.
Right.
So we've already got the numbers. It's just, you got to work out all these other forces that are playing around at the moment.
Yeah.
So again, I don't have the answer for 1,000 years away, but I do have the answer for this afternoon. Just come back to get fresh, local, seasonal, whole food, based on your culture and environment, avoiding added sugar and processed food.
It's a very simple answer to a complex problem. And I think that we can both say that I don't think that our podcast would exist without a lot of the work that we've done. So number one, we just wanted to say thank you. We want to do this podcast just to be able to spread the messaging as much as possible and help build that 3% coalition that's needed. Dr. Gery, what's the best way for people to connect with you just to learn more about the work that you're doing?
Look, my lectures, Belinda's lectures, most of those are on YouTube. Okay. So you look up Fettke, Fettke, and you'll find most of those there. Belinda's got a website called isupportgarry.com, which was there to help me get off and she puts a lot of her research on that. I've got an outdated website called nofructose.com, which is on my to-do list of getting that up to date. I'm on Twitter. Garry Fettke is fructose no, but Belinda's doing a bit more on the Facebook page called Belinda Fettke No Fructose. That used to be called Garry Fettke No Fructose. And when I got charged by the medical board, we literally just drew a line through Garry and wrote Belinda and changed it, and it sort of it kept the message going. We were able to extend the middle finger in the process.
Don't forget, you have another to do, which is to get healthyfatslowcarb.com up and running too, because that's a great domain that's just sitting there right now.
I've got to fit a few other things into my life as well.
I know, right?
I could have done it, except I've spent that entire time with you guys this morning. So there
exactly.
I look at it this way. There's an old video about how to start a movement. I don't know if you've seen that on YouTube.
No.
How to start a movement.
Start a movement.
I think it's called that. And it's a guy dancing on a hill in some sort of festival. And he's just dancing around strangely, and everyone's sort of looking at him. And then another person stands up beside him and starts dancing strangely. And then all of a sudden everyone gets into the whole thing. It's not a long video, but it's quite interesting. What's critical in that is that the first person who stood up and danced strangely was nowhere as important as the second person who stood up beside him.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're all out there doing some strange stuff. And when you find another person that's actually doing, oh, hang on, maybe I'm not alone. And so therefore you only gain momentum when the second person stands beside the first.
Absolutely.
And you guys already know that. You've got your health journey, you've got your health benefits. So when we stand beside each other, we gain momentum.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we're standing beside each other, and you've got a much warmer climate around you than I have right now. from the other side of the planet.
No.
Well,
But
I think that these movements are really obviously coming to the surface at a really important point in time, and it's exciting to be able to share this conversation with you and share it with our audience, because I think that people will just get a ton of value out of everything you've had to share today. And we're very excited to have Belinda on to talk about some of the topics that you alluded to earlier.
I'll encourage her to respond to the emails. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll keep pounding her.
We'll track her down, hopefully. Yeah, put in a good word for us if you can.
I'll just leave it at that. I was going to say something, but even I know when to shut up. Okay.
Exactly. Especially when she's in the same room as you too.
Absolutely. You know, she's over there in the corner.
Oh man. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gery. This was an amazing conversation. We would be honored to have you back any other time to come on for a part 2. And hopefully we get to link up in person at some point, whenever that is in the future.
Yeah. One of these days when the world's, whatever the new normal is. Okay. Just to coin a very stupid term. Okay.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Dr. Fettke. This is amazing.
All right. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
You too.